Hi, chefs, and thank you for joining this session. Today, we are going to talk about cloud security posture management. And if you've never heard about cloud security posture management, this is the place to be. We're actually going to learn what CSPM is and why we should care. I'm Kiah Tolliver, developer advocate here at Progress Chef, based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. And my goal here is to make this the best virtual CSPM panel discussion that you've ever attended. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Sarah Gori, who's the consulting director at ScaleSec. She's based out of the DC area and happy that she's joined us. Thank you for joining us, Sarah. We also have Konrad Shiban. He is a strategic cloud engineer at Google, and he's based out of Munich, Germany, where there's no central AC from what I've heard. So thank you for joining us, Toasty Konrad. So we are going to talk about CSPM, and Gartner defines CSPM as a continuous process of cloud security improvement and adaptations to reduce the likelihood of a successful security attack. So let's start with you, Konrad. Considering that all cloud services aren't created equal from a security and compliance perspective, what should our audience consider when assessing their cloud providers from a security and compliance standpoint?
Thanks, Kiah, for the question. So I think to assess security and compliance of your cloud environment, you should make sure that you have both the right tooling that you're comfortable with, as well as the appropriate methodology that gives developers agility and security staff confidence that your cloud environment is secure. Of course, in order to choose the right tooling, you need to know what kind of methodology you're going to follow. So to start off with the methodology, organizations may adopt different approaches for security and compliance and ensuring it, depending on the maturity level of the development team. So one approach is to have centralized tooling to scan your cloud environment on a schedule or based on certain events which trigger the scan or whenever a security team would like to do. Organizations that follow that approach often do that outside a application SDLC of the cloud infrastructure. For development teams without a mature DevSecOps methodology, this is often the simplest approach. However, another approach is also to integrate security policies directly into the SDLC of the cloud infrastructure by using security policy as code. In that case, development teams run compliance checks directly in GitOps pipelines and receive feedback as early as possible in the SDLC process. So this is where tooling such as ChefInspect really shines and can be used to allow developers to integrate those policies directly into their repositories. And the tooling should be selected depending on which methodology works best for you. So whether you want to follow the centralized approach to scan your cloud environment for security and compliance, or whether you want to give your developers the freedom to integrate those policies directly in their CI/CD process. So from a tooling perspective, this is where ChefInspect could be used. And especially if you're running a multi-cloud or hybrid cloud environment, you need to make sure that your tooling also supports all of these to have a consistent.
What about you, Sarah? Do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, absolutely. And Konrad, that was an incredibly good answer to the question. And, you know, what methodology you choose to go for, you know, like Kiah said, depends on your situation, your culture, your development team's maturity. What is the best way to implement this? So, you know, ensure that that risk level that you're looking for while meeting the business need, the development team's needs. And, you know, for that methodology, it also depends on what compliance framework and what security requirements set you're operating with. So whether, what compliance framework are you looking at? HIPAA, FedRAMP, PCI? Do you have your own set of internal security requirements that you've gone for? Are you going for a more industry standard set of security requirements, like leveraging something like NIST CSF? And that's also going to drive a lot of how you do what you do to achieve the posture that you want. And so, step one, I would say, take a look at that. And then it's understanding, what you can do with the requirements that the cloud provider handles versus what you, as the user of the cloud, are required to do. The shared responsibility model, or shared fate model, like Google, calls it as. And then building your strategy for how you're going to meet those requirements that you're responsible for, that is your fate. And then, driving your tooling around that. Whether you're, leveraging centralized tooling, or, whether you're first prioritizing, moving that to the left into your pipelines, is going to depend on the maturity of your organization. If you have an environment where you have multiple teams that are leveraging a standard pipeline, you're going to get a lot more value early on from integrating that security into that centralized standard pipeline that might be used to deploy to the cloud. Whereas if you're dealing with more of an environment that's more heterogeneous instead of homogeneous in how they deploy to the cloud, how they architect and design, leaning into that centralized tooling and scanning is going to get you more return for your investment there. So looking at those things. And then one thing I'll finally add is, depending on what compliance framework you're looking at, different services for different providers are going to really matter. If we talk about FedRAMP, for example, looking at the ATO and making sure that you're making decisions based on that, or looking at HIPAA and making sure that you're leveraging the services that have been vetted and are good to use from a HIPAA perspective on the cloud provider side, and then starting there.
Great. Awesome. I appreciate that explanation. So let's talk, Sarah, about governance and how the approach to governance changes when you start to look at cloud services versus traditional on-prem. What are some of the guardrails that organizations might consider putting in place when it comes to cloud technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, when you consider what you can do and what's available to you, whether you're looking to, do governance or, manage your posture on-prem versus in the cloud, this is one of the places where the cloud environment really shines. For one, when you're looking at an on-prem situation, you are in control of absolutely everything. And that means that from a governance perspective, you have a lot on your plate that you need to manage. And where cloud shines there is in centralized management and centralized control, those guardrails that you were talking about, where to perform governance, it's a much more spread, and it can be much more challenging to manage. So that centralized management that you can get out of your cloud platforms is again, where the value comes in. So in terms of guardrails, right, there's both kind of protective and control oriented guardrails, and there's detective oriented guardrails.
Okay.
Where depending on, again, your methodology and what's best for your organization, how much you can block and prevent versus how much you need to detect and respond to will drive what kinds of guardrails you want to put in place. So if you need to have a lighter touch for your development experience and your business needs, you're probably going to be looking at more detective and informative guardrails that you can action on versus preventive and hard shutdown controls. And for example, and so I guess just to talk about the two clouds that we work with primarily at ScaleSec are AWS and GCP. So that's going to be a bit of my focus here. So like with AWS, you're looking at organization policies, you're looking at config. In GCP, you're also looking at organization policies, VPC service controls. What you get out of security command center are all going to be, you know, your cloud native entry points for implementing guardrails in the cloud. And you might look at, for example, in AWS, blocking your ability to generate access keys for your root user. You know, that's a
Mhm.
the AWS has out of the box. You could be restricting SSH access to your endpoints.
Right.
And then there's a lot that, you know, you can prevent or detect. So do you want to prevent public buckets from existing within your environment? Do you want to detect, alert, and action on public buckets that are accessible to the internet? Again, preventing or detecting, you know, just think of they're both options, right? So we're talking
Right.
about credentials without multi-factor authentication, unencrypted data stores, potential data exposures in a number of different services, right? And there's the possibility for implementing guardrails for all of them. Uh,
Mhm.
and you can also do it for, you know, just managing and ensuring your environment is operating the way you want. For example, with your logging strategy, making sure that people aren't tampering with the logs that exist within your buckets and applying controls there. I mean, of course, you can do it through identity access control, but a guardrail is going to be making sure that it is done centrally and across the organization instead of individual access control for a specific bucket or a specific user type.
Okay. Now, as a follow-on question for that, like, would you consider, I know auto remediation is a really huge part of CSPM, a CSPM tool. Would you consider that like one of the necessary guardrails, like to turn on? Is that something that like most
Yeah,
companies and most organizations should use?
absolutely. And so when I talk about protective versus detective,
Mhm.
right, I would say that auto remediation falls kind of into the middle where preventive is your most your strictest, most conservative option for how to lock something down,
Mhm.
right? Auto remediation is going to be your next strictest, right? And then
Right.
detective investigation and response is going to be your most reactive and your lightest impact to your developer experience.
Okay.
Now, where prevention is going to stop you entirely from doing something, of course, you know, you want to make sure that you're 100% getting it right when you are, you know, applying prevention. The same
Right.
is true for automated remediation because it is happening instantaneously without human analysis or intervention. So again, that has to be a higher fidelity an atomic thing that you are looking to do your automation on.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Konrad, what do you have to add about what are some of the guardrails that organizations might consider putting in place when it comes to cloud technologies?
Yeah, so Sarah mentioned a lot of really amazing points there. She mentioned, for instance, that the clouds offer amazing capabilities for the centralized capabilities of security monitoring, and that is absolutely the case. But there's also another shift that has happened compared to traditional on-prem infrastructure compared to cloud infrastructure, and that is the adoption of infrastructure as code.
Mm.
So that really has introduced a significant change in the security governance, because now, in contrast to traditional ways of working in on-prem IT, now developer have the ability to deploy infrastructure as code directly in their CI/CD pipeline. So with that increased agility, there's also more responsibility that developers have. So the cloud has now made infrastructure deployment much more transparent to development teams, which are now able to develop, to deploy and modify their infrastructure using public APIs. So now they need to add security guardrails into their SDLC process. These guardrails can be, for instance, using security policy templates that are tailored to meet security benchmarks, like, for instance, the CIS benchmark or PCI DSS control set, and they can be directly integrated into CI/CD pipelines. When you compare that to traditional on-prem IT, where there needed to be more emphasis on physical security of a customer's data center and hardware infrastructure, this really needed to be managed by a centralized team, and that was not really transparent to developer teams.
That makes sense. So, like, one of the I guess problems, or one of the challenges in the evolution of CSPM was, it's kind of like trying to figure out who owns it, right? And I guess that's kind of what it seems like what you were alluding to, or one of the points that you made. So I think that's very interesting. And now with some of these CSPM tools and that a lot of the providers are offering, it makes it a lot more clear. Konrad, you did mention infrastructure and policy as code, and maybe it was infrastructure as code in your previous answer. And that really leads me to some of our offerings. You use ChefInspect in your security tech stack, correct?
Yeah, I have worked with ChefInspect before. So some of our customers are using ChefInspect, particularly ones that operate multi-cloud and hybrid cloud environments, because they want to use a consistent framework for checking security policies and compliance frameworks across all their environments. So I've worked with customers who are interested in state-of-the-art deployment lifecycles on Google Cloud, and also want to ensure security compliance by default. So by working with these customers, we have developed benchmark profiles that are readily available to you on GitHub. They are open sourced. So many customers want to have that content readily available for them, that are standardized and agreed upon standards, standards that have been created by the Center of Internet Security, CIS. And with customers, we have created the infrastructure as code templates to create their GCP landing zone and their entire infrastructure for shared services and for applications, as well as the security policies that are integrated in the deployment lifecycle that also confirms that they're meeting the security and compliance benchmarks that they need to adhere to, be it for regulatory reasons, or they just want to follow best practice and always make sure that cloud storage buckets are not public.
Right. Right. That's huge. So, Sarah, what is your opinion on how organizations are raising the cost for attackers and empowering security operation centers within their organizations?
So first of all, I think that's a great question. I think that, the cost for attackers to achieve their objectives is absolutely the right way to think about it, especially with the more organized attacker groups that, we as security professionals have to deal with. And so, first I want to go through, what actually makes it more costly for attackers, right? So the first thing is making it harder to succeed in the first place. So, having good security hygiene, having good hardening processes, remove that low-hanging fruit for the attacker. But then being able to find and remove the attacker's presence faster would be number two. And, number three, kind of similar to one, is addressing root cause when you find it. So it might not be low-hanging fruit, like we talked about, in point one, but it is something that the attacker was able to use to succeed on. So actioning on it and making sure that you close that door behind them after you kick them out of your environment, right? And so where can security operations centers really shine in those places. One is in responding faster and removing their presence faster. And so that is all about expertise in the cloud and automation. So making sure that our security operations teams have that depth of knowledge and expertise in the cloud in order to, know what kind of analysis to perform, what compromise looks at for these cloud resources, and then leveraging automation to do response faster, gather information faster. Every incident responder knows that time is of the essence once a compromise has been found. And so, but there are many pieces and opportunities to leverage automation here. We talked about auto remediation earlier. This is, again, where that comes right in. And it's going to be more effective depending on the overall enterprise's relationship with resource deployment. So, if you have a model where you can leverage something like a kill build model and easily redeploy from a place that is good and trusted, then you can respond very quickly by killing and rebuilding and, leveraging your disaster recovery approach instead of needing to remediate resources live. So again, security operations centers can be much more effective, but it's dependent upon the strategy and approach that they're taking all the way on the left side of the security spectrum with how they're deploying and configuring their resources.
Nice, great answer. Konrad, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, that was definitely a great answer. Thanks, Sarah. So I think an empowered security operations center should be empowered to monitor, assess, and defend any kind of threats to the organization's IT. And so in order for a security operations center to be effective and be able to monitor, assess, and defend their environment, they need to be able to observe the organization's IT infrastructure as a whole, using some kind of central tooling that gives them the observability into the infrastructure and applications. And then they can also act on relevant events. So this is why security operations centers should be equipped with the right tooling that is needed to have this holistic view of resource monitoring, activity, and audit logging. So for me, specifically working on Google Cloud, the Cloud Operations Center is a great single pane of glass that gives you an overview over your Google Cloud infrastructure and lets you view all audit and activity logs that you can then filter on and create events on which you then can act upon.
Got it. Great answer. I appreciate that. Konrad, what would you say are the top trending security threats in the cloud currently?
Yeah, so some of the security threats that really that are the most common ones and that all security staff really have on the top of their mind are the ones that you can really remediate easily, but you can also do them wrong really by toggling a certain button. So the things that I have in mind is accidentally providing public access to cloud storage buckets, accidentally providing public IP addresses to VMs that should be internal, misconfigured IAM policies like providing read and write access to staff without legitimate access, legitimate need to access the resources. And of course, also service account key material leaking outside of the resources. So it's really important to know that for all of these are exacerbated in environments that are not strictly managed with infrastructure as code. Like for instance, demo environments or dev environments where you can simply deploy resources and modify them by clicking around and not really adhering to best practices. And developers often lean to quick and dirty solutions or quick and dirty workarounds in lower environments to access resources via public access, for instance, because other guardrails are blocking them for immediately moving further. So it's really important to strictly adhere to GitOps, CI/CD using infrastructure as code, and have a 4i review process that is established.
Before
Also,
go
yeah.
ahead. I was going to
I
ask you the 4i review process, but like finish your thought and then we could go back to that.
Yeah. So just one thing to add to all of these security issues that I just mentioned. So yes, infrastructure as code and GitOps pipeline, they allow us to track and also remediate in case of misconfigurations. But there are also guardrails, and Sarah mentioned them earlier, specifically on GCP. We have organization policies that really allow you to simply apply certain policies to prevent those kind of things that you would never want to have in a production environment, like public cloud storage buckets, where you not specifically host a static website that should be public, but that contains more confidential material. So it's a really easy way to enforce best security practice to keep your environment secure, and it does not cost anything. So use that tooling that comes out of the box.
Absolutely. So like let's talk about that 4i review process. Like what can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Well, that's pretty simple. So if you have a GitOps pipeline where all of your infrastructure is deployed via a triggered pipeline based on Git merges to a main branch, the pull request would trigger a review by one of your teammates. And one of your teammates would then look over the code changes that you have created, ideally not only on the code, but also on some executed infrastructure plan. So when I think of an infrastructure plan and doing that on Google Cloud, I often think of how you would do that in Terraform. And Terraform allows you to create a Terraform plan, which lists you all the changes in the infrastructure that are going to be made, what is going to be deleted, what is going to be added, what is going to be modified before you deploy anything. So if you have that as part of your pipeline, either both you and your teammate can look at those changes and then provide an approval before you merge the changes into the main branch, which is then going to be deployed.
Okay, and I thank you for that. I do have another follow-up question because we were talking about we were talking about security in lower environments, and can you elaborate on why security in lower environments is really important? Because a lot of times we think about like maybe our UAT environment and of course our production environment, but like tell me why it's important to consider our development environments when we are talking about cloud security.
Yeah, so a lower environment is really where developers want to have the most flexibility and the ability to quickly check if any kind of planned changes will work. So if they want to develop any kind of feature, they want immediately feedback, does this work or not?
Right.
However, if you do not adhere to any kinds of security best practice in that environment, you risk, as an example, leaking service account keys. Somebody may just download a service account key and use that from a laptop, or upload the key for quick sharing to a public bucket, or send it via an email, and so on and so on. If a service account gets leaked to that environment, from that environment, it provides an open door to any malicious attacker who wants to gain to your company's infrastructure. And once an attacker has gained access to the infrastructure, they may also be able to find other doors to other environment, and you may also have material information in your lower environments as well. So it might not be live production data, but there may be a path for an attacker to gain access to more confidential data.
Okay. And that seems like a pretty low cost, like vulnerability, I guess, a vulnerability in which to take advantage of that as a bad actor, it doesn't take much, right? Sarah, do you have anything to add to that? Because that was something that wasn't really, like, I think that's something we should really talk about, because, as a former developer, who's had, a hand tap by security folks in the past by saying, like, no, you aren't supposed to do these things. Like, I think it's really important to kind of to drill that in,
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Konrad covered a lot of bases there, and made some really excellent points. And a lot of it has to do too with what your general otherwise security controls are, right? So heaven forbid your development environment has some kind of connectivity to your production environment. It is a fundamental security best practice that you don't. However, unfortunately, that is not always the case in everybody's environments. So whether, production might have a dependency on another environment, or there is some kind of connectivity, in that case, if you're not treating your development environment with the same level of priority as your production environment, that drastically increases the risk that you are posing to your production environment, just as like an example. And people within the development environment, like Konrad said, are they're figuring out how to make things work. Sometimes in order to do that, you have to test permissions and evaluate why something doesn't work, which often means expanding and retracting permissions, but those permissions don't always get retracted back down. And so making sure that things like that don't make it into further deployments or environments. So it's a cascading effect, right? What happens in development does affect other environment spaces as well, even if there's not production data there. It also, heaven forbid an attacker got access to a developer environment, it also gives them a pretty good idea of what might be under the hood in the production environment that they couldn't see from the outside looking in. Get an idea of their general architecture, do investigation to figure out what else might be compromisable in the production environment. And then environments that we haven't really chatted about, though I think we mentioned earlier, are demo environments, sandbox spaces. So, if you use a sandbox model to evaluate services, figure out how something works, you can have those same challenges there if you're not very carefully managing, how long a sandbox exists for, what they have access to. It can also be a billing challenge, right? If people are requesting and using sandboxes, deploying resources and letting them languish, not necessarily a security risk, but absolutely a business risk. So there's a lot to consider with these lower level environments.
Great points. Great points. Thank you all for that. I think that's a really important topic. It really seems to be, under the umbrella of security hygiene, right? Sarah, let's talk about security hygiene. Like, do you feel that, I guess this is, almost goes without saying, security hygiene should be a top priority. Do you feel that? And why?
Absolutely. I kind of think of it as going from being the firefighter to being the fire marshal, right? So if you're dealing with security problems and you're dealing with, compromises, and your incident response team has a lot of work to do, right? Lean into your security hygiene so that you are getting in front of those threats. And a lot of that does, really that focus on moving security to the left bringing security forward, addressing these issues sooner, not only does that mean that you're reducing your risk in your attack surface by improving your hygiene, but it's also less costly to fix these security flaws if you can get in front of them sooner, if you can find them faster, both from a risk impact perspective, but also from a developer perspective. We want, even as security people, we want the developers to spend their time innovating, right? And, returning that value to the business. And if, we're finding security flaws after the fact, after they've been deployed, and we have to then go, bring those issues as a priority item back into their backlog, it's disruptive to, what their plans and priorities are. But if we can address them up front as a part of building those features in the first place, then, it saves the business money. And it makes the developers' lives easier too. So there are many reasons why security hygiene should be a priority.
Awesome answer. Konrad, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, so when I think of security hygiene, I think of the day-to-day tasks you may want to do to maintain the health of your environment. So as an example, if for whatever reason an untrusted firewall port is open to the internet, there has to be a way to audit this configuration, and you have to be alerted in a timely manner. So if you do not follow proper security hygiene, you risk running a non-compliant or misconfigured environment for a prolonged period of time and allowing attackers to exploit vulnerabilities that you would otherwise catch. So it's important to establish regular processes to ensure you understand the configuration of your cloud environment and that you can run reports to get an overview of your environment. So you should also be able to check regularly if you're in compliance, or if you're not only good from a security posture, but also in compliance with the regulatory frameworks that you need to adhere to. So leaving the considerations of having security checks in the SDLC aside, you should be able to review the health and compliance of your environment at any time. Coming back to InSpec, InSpec can be used to execute benchmark profiles, as I mentioned earlier. So you can make sure to review the output reports and most conveniently scan them programmatically for non-compliant checks.
Awesome. Sarah, what do you think the risks of ransomware are against the cloud consumer? And what are the best ways to protect against these risks? I'm sure our audience is really interested in it.
But ransomware is a very serious threat, first of all, right? We hear in the news about the unfortunate victims that have been made public of dealing with ransomware cases where they are, facing incredibly high cost ransoms and their business critical data hangs in the balance. So what do you do to not end up in that situation, right? And there's two pieces to it. First is, how do you prevent ransomware from happening in the first place? And then what do you do, heaven forbid, you are dealing with an active ransomware attack and your business critical data has been made inaccessible to you, right? So the first one, ties back to that security hygiene, making sure that there is not a way for that malware to get a foothold within your environment and actually execute to attack your data. And some of that too, which we haven't talked too much about, there's a user component there too, with phishing and tricking users into clicking and executing on. That's a little less cloud focused, but is absolutely a vector that we see from a ransomware perspective. And then what do you do once you are dealing with a ransomware attack? And that is all about your disaster recovery and business continuity plans, your data protection and data management. Do you have data backups? Do you know that, you can leverage those data backups and get back up and running without having to deal with the reality of the ransom that is being demanded because of this attack? So really it's focusing on that data protection strategy. Can you recover from a ransomware attack? Can you recover from a data disruption or data loss? And what do you have in place to do that? So, if you are worrying about a ransomware attack, in addition to putting those capabilities in place, it's a good thing to test occasionally. Let's say, all of a sudden you lose access to data in a bucket or data in an EBS volume or, something larger. What do you do? Is it backed up? Can you, in production, if you have to, recover from that data loss? And how quickly, and for these tabletop scenarios, evaluating what is the worst scenario to make sure that you're prepared for it is really key. You can do that type of testing in a staging environment if you're, really concerned about disrupting business models and your operations. But those are really what you want to focus on to make sure that you're truly prepared for a ransomware attack.
For sure. That's great advice. Absolutely. Konrad, what would you say are the differences between like on-prem and cloud environments where, with regards to, the incident response perspective?
Okay, so one of the difference from incident response perspective certainly include the layers of responsibility that you manage in IT. So in traditional on-prem IT, where you manage and own every aspect of your stack, you will need to orchestrate any incident response on each level, such as hardware, physical network infrastructure, virtualization layer, software failover, and so on. And the complexity of incident response, such as disaster recovery, is immense, as you will have to orchestrate the response. So you have to orchestrate the work of so many teams who have different responsibilities in your IT. Now, incident response in the cloud can be, in many cases, be drastically simpler. So this is because the cloud provider takes care of some of the levels in a shared responsibility model. So in the shared responsibility model, a cloud provider owns a certain part of the stack on which your applications run on, and takes away some of the responsibility that you would otherwise have to take care of on-prem. So for instance, if you're using an IaaS-based hosting model, your cloud provider will manage the underlying infrastructure, and you will simply have the VM, the guest OS, and everything on top of that. And you will only have to respond to incidents on that layer upwards, where your cloud provider manages any kinds of incidents on the hardware layer. And going even further, if you want to use something like a PaaS service, so a managed Kubernetes offering like Google Kubernetes Engine on Google Cloud, then you get a lot more things for free, such as resiliency across multiple isolated zones. So you don't even need to manage the incident response in case of a zonal outage, because your hosting option is resilient enough to catch that and keep your application alive even in the case of an outage.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. Sarah, what do you have to add?
Yeah, and as Konrad said, a lot of it ties to what layers incident response has to focus on, and what is the full scope of the attack surface that they need to be aware of, monitor, understand, and respond to. Right? If we're talking about on-prem, that means that those systems are living in a physical location that the company and therefore the incident responders are responsible for. So the threat could be everything from physically present with where those systems are deployed to all of those management levels in between, and where there is a smaller stack and surface to focus on within a cloud environment. Now, that being said, there's so many different services and so many different types of potential resources that there are different things to look for. And so the incident response team needs to be aware of what those are. Detections need to be built out for it. And I mean, fortunately, depending on what type of service, there can be a potentially pretty small attack surface that's available, depending on exactly how it's architected. But there is that detection and investigative need for a more diverse set of components within the cloud. So pros and cons. But again, that's where, I go back to what I said about automation, where, as soon as what the kind of key vectors are, especially if you know what the behavior is supposed to be for a given resource, you can really start doing some interesting things with automation to identify and address potentially malicious activity. And as you start to get into more of that behavioral component too, you can leverage things like tagging or labeling to really, say this is what this resource or set of services is supposed to be used for, to kind of inform your analysis too, which you don't always have the luxury of in an on-prem environment.
That's a good point. Okay, I think those are both great answers. Thank you so much. So Sarah, let's talk about misconfigurations. How do you prevent misconfigurations in your cloud environment?
Oh, great question. And there's a couple of different key ways to prevent misconfigurations. We lightly touched on a lot of them, right? It's for one, moving security to the left. What security checkpoints can you apply to your pipeline? From how your application is built and configured, leveraging infrastructure as code additionally in your pipeline so that you have everything defined and easily accessible for what's deployed to look at those configurations. There are ways to do checks and evaluations against that infrastructure, as Konrad was talking about earlier, to look for what you don't want to see in your infrastructure as code. So the sooner you can do it, the better. But if for misconfigurations that do make it into your cloud environment, Konrad's talked about inspec. There's cloud native options as well to help you swiftly identify, your core misconfigurations, the issues that really keep you up at night, and also guardrails, right? So there's finding them, but there's also preventing them, and building those guardrails around how you want your organization to operate. And so, I just say, kind of in short, for preventing misconfigurations, moving security to the left, bringing security into your pipeline, implementing guardrails, your cloud native guardrails, and then having that good visibility that you need into your environment for what misconfigurations trickle through the cracks in between those countermeasures, which I think we've touched on in other questions too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really specific answer, and I really appreciate that. Konrad, what do you have to add?
Yeah, so I think Sarah touched on the most important points, certainly. So to prevent misconfigurations, use infrastructure as code, most importantly. So you have, as we mentioned earlier, the 4i review process of your deployment pipelines using infrastructure as code and the Terraform output plans. Also, in case there are misconfigurations that are being performed manually, your deployment pipeline would then automatically remediate it if your pipeline is triggered again. So that is one important aspect. Next, security policy as code and testing of your code is also important. So there are testing frameworks, not only for your application code, but also for your infrastructure. So make sure that you always check the most important things, specifically around security, and that you have security guardrails in your pipeline. Be it, for instance, You make sure that only trusted and approved Terraform modules are being deployed, that your resources or that IAM policies are not too open and provide granular access to your resources. There are a lot more policies that you can think of. You can also use one of the pre-existing open sourced one that we have open source for CIS, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And integrate those security policies into your cloud infrastructure SDLC.
Okay, that makes sense. That absolutely does. When you say you're using Docker, right, and you're using like the default container names, for instance, how do either of you have like an opinion about how that may affect security, and who wants to go first?
Maybe I quickly touch on the defaults, because I think that's very spot on, not to always use the defaults of any kind of basic deployment that you can make. So we have open source, very opinionated Terraform modules that give you the best practices in the deployment of resources and how resources are stitched together in the cloud. Those are called the Cloud Foundation Toolkit.
Mm-hmm.
And they do not use the defaults. Like, for instance, a very common default on Google Cloud is to use the default compute engine service account for everything, because that is a very powerful service account, and it gives you editor rights to other resources as well. But it makes much more sense from a security posture perspective to use a more specific, fine-grained service accounts that you can then assign to your resources, rather than using a service account that has access to everything.
Okay.
And even more so, other than the Cloud Foundation Toolkit, we also have the Cloud Foundation Fabric, which you do not have to, which gives you opinionated best practice landing zones according to architecture blueprints of your cloud landing zone that you can use. And those are not created using default projects in which everything is just comes out of the box, but more based on the opinionated best practices that we provide as Google Professional Services.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. So if we go back to your compliance frameworks, or what your security strategy is at large, right? What security requirements you're building against, designing against, configuring against. It's a pretty safe bet that whatever the defaults is of a tool that you start with, it's not going to be in line with what your security requirements are. And you won't know that, right, until you've evaluated what the configurations are. Have you flipped the levers that you need to put simply, to meet your enterprise's, your organization's security strategy. So, first and foremost, without even delving into like what defaults are problematic, just, as a rule, you won't know unless you evaluate your configuration as you build it against what your strategy is, what requirements you are obligated to, first and foremost. And, take Docker, for example. There are some Docker versions where, network traffic isn't locked down by default, right? So just looking at like what kind of connectivity you're facing there can be a risk. Users aren't namespaced by default in Docker. So, if a process breaks out of a container, that can be a serious problem. And so these are just, what are the attack vectors? What creates a larger attack surface, like that security calculus, if you will. But you won't know if what you're using and if those defaults are acceptable for your environment unless you consider, what are your requirements at large and are you meeting them? Because like I said, it's a pretty safe bet that those defaults, whatever they are not reliably going to meet your requirements unless you take a look at it and make that judgment call. at which point you would probably be changing some of those defaults anyway.
Okay, that makes sense. So don't just blindly use the defaults. That's the message. This is great. So one final question. I think this is specifically for you, Konrad, because last ChefConf, you spoke about assessing the security of Kubernetes with Inspect, and specifically about how you were using Inspect at Google. And I guess, like, what developments have occurred over the last year at Google using Chef Inspect?
Yeah, good question. So last year we talked about how you use Inspect to scan Kubernetes holistically in your environment, which includes your cloud platform, which includes the Kubernetes API outside of the managed service, as well as the file system where Kubernetes runs on. And right now we have open sourced multiple repositories on GitHub that give you out of the box compliance frameworks using Inspect, such as the CIS benchmark for GCP, everything except GKE, but a very specific one for GKE as well, as well as a benchmark profile for PCI DSS. And we have many Google Cloud customers that use Inspect in production. And with the help of the community engineers that are using Inspect in their day-to-day work, we are continuing to enhance and maintain these repositories on Google Cloud. So my call to action, as always, is to really use these repositories to get started quickly and use the best practices. And if you have any inputs, if you find any issues, or you have suggestions that you may want to address via pull requests, please go ahead and get in touch, and we can continue to enhance and maintain these repositories together.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. This has been a great conversation. This has been an amazing discussion. Thank you so much, Sarah and Konrad, for joining us today. I think the audience has a much better understanding of what CSPM is and why it should be important to their company. Any final remarks before we wrap it up for the evening?
Well, I'll go first. So, thank you for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure getting to speak and kind of play off answers and responses with you, Konrad. And I do think that we've talked about some really important and valuable things from a cloud security perspective, things to think about. And I hope that, our folks that are watching have, a bunch of ideas now for things that they either can be doing more of, or feel really great if they've heard a bunch of things that they've gotten to check off along the way that we've mentioned are important and valuable. And so I'd also say thank you for listening.
Awesome.
I'd like to second Sarah's comments as well. So thank you, Kiah and community, to have us here today and speak about those DevSecOps and security topics. This is actually my third ChefConf this year, and it's always a pleasure to contribute as a speaker or a panelist. So unfortunately, you can't see it easily today, but this is actually the original swag from ChefConf from 2020.
Nice.
And yeah, always happy to be here. And I hope everybody could take something away from our discussion. And I look forward to speaking to you another time soon.